In 1899, a man named John MacDonald stepped into a gathering of financiers and informed them he could excavate a tunnel 21 miles in length beneath the most densely populated city in the United States, cutting through solid granite, slipping past the footings of 1,000 buildings, and crossing beneath rivers that had never been spanned by bridges, all without damaging a single structure on the surface. The financiers replied that the municipality would never fund such a project. MacDonald said he understood. He had a construction partner, August Belmont, who was prepared to finance it privately. The city would receive the tunnel. Belmont would run it for 50 years. After that half-century, control would revert to the city. A single vote in the Board of Aldermen. It carried, and on March 24, 1900, at City Hall Park in Lower Manhattan, the mayor of New York drove a silver spade into the soil. The spectators roared their approval. The newspapers printed the engineering drawings, and then the city of New York unleashed 12,000 men into the underground. They had no mechanical tunnel boring machines. They had no GPS, no ground-penetrating radar, no structural survey of what rested beneath the pavement. What they possessed was dynamite, compressed air drills, hand shovels, and diagrams drawn from recollection by men who had been excavating under New York for 30 years and who knew the positions of the sewer lines because they had laid them with their own hands. The subway was not designed by engineers in corporate offices. It was constructed by men laboring in darkness 40 feet below Broadway, breathing air thick with granite dust that would slowly destroy a man's lungs if the explosions didn't kill him first. I have spent months poring over the contractor's ledgers, the coroner's registers, and the accident reports submitted to the Rapid Transit Commission from 1900 through 1904. What I have discovered is a narrative that almost no one tells. The story of how the workers at the bottom of the excavation built the system that made modern New York City possible, and the price they paid to accomplish it. Here is what you need to understand before any of it becomes clear. By 1900, New York City faced a crisis that was about to choke it. Manhattan Island is 13 miles long and 2 miles wide at its broadest point. In 1900, 2 million people lived there, not in the 5 boroughs collectively, but on the island itself. 2 million human beings packed into 23 square miles of bedrock. The elevated railways, the Ls, had been operating since the 1870s. They carried 500,000 passengers daily. They were running at absolute capacity. The streets were jammed with horse-drawn wagons, electric trolleys, pushcarts, and pedestrians so numerous that a man trying to cross Broadway at noon could wait 10 minutes for an opening to appear. The city was locking up. A laborer who worked in the garment district on the Lower East Side and lived in Harlem spent 2 hours each day on the streets just traveling to and from his job. Every hour of that commute was an hour he could not spend working, sleeping, or being with his family. And the city was still expanding. 100,000 immigrants passed through Ellis Island each year, and a large portion of them remained. New York in 1900 was roughly doubling in population every 20 years, and there was no remaining space to construct on the surface. The subway was the sole solution. The question was how to build it. The chief engineer for the project was William Barclay Parsons, born in 1859 in New York City, a Columbia graduate, trained in railroad surveying. He had spent 4 years in China studying the construction of the imperial railways before he was brought on to design the New York subway. He was 41 years old when the contract was signed. Systematic, precise, the type of man who stored his correspondence in labelled folders and maintained his field notebooks in a uniform handwriting. His survey of the proposed route, conducted in 1895, ran to 300 pages. Parsons faced a problem with no precedent in American engineering. Most of the proposed line ran directly beneath the most critical streets in one of the most heavily built cities on Earth: Broadway, Park Avenue, the Bowery. Under those streets was not empty soil. There were gas mains, water mains, sewer tunnels, telegraph conduits, and the foundations of buildings that had been rising since the 1840s. Nobody possessed a complete map of any of it. The gas company had partial records. The water department had partial records. The telegraph company had its own documents stored independently. No single office held a unified picture of what existed beneath the streets. Parsons dispatched survey teams into every utility access shaft along the proposed corridor. They charted what they encountered. They marked conflicts. They redesigned segments of the route to bypass obstacles they could not relocate, and then they began to dig. The construction method employed on the majority of the line was called cut and cover. You open the street from above, excavate a rectangular trench to the necessary depth, construct the tunnel framework inside the trench, then backfill over it and restore the pavement. It sounds simple. In Manhattan in 1900, it was one of the most complex logistical undertakings ever attempted in a civilian environment. Every gas main lying in the path of the cut had to be rerouted before the shovels entered the ground. Every water main, every sewer. On some blocks, there were 8 or 10 separate utility networks at different depths. Some had been installed decades apart with no coordination between agencies. Crews would open a section of street, begin digging, and strike a cast iron pipe that appeared on no record held by any municipal department. They would halt, send a runner to find the relevant authority, wait for an engineer to arrive and identify it, reroute it, and then resume work. On certain blocks, this process occurred 3 or 4 times before they reached tunnel depth. The street remained open throughout this period, or at least attempted to. Wooden planks were laid across the trench on timber supports so that trolley cars and wagons could continue travelling overhead while men worked in the excavation below. The planking flexed under the weight of traffic. Dirt filtered through the gaps. The workers below wore it in their hair and across their faces all day long, and when a heavily loaded delivery wagon struck a weakened plank at the wrong angle, the plank would give way and the wheel would punch through. If a man happened to be directly underneath, the result depended entirely on where he was positioned. The rock was the other major difficulty. Manhattan sits on a base of schist and granite that is, in some places, among the hardest stone on Earth. Below 50th Street, the bedrock runs close to the surface, in some locations only a few feet beneath the street level. The tunnels had to pass straight through it. Dynamite was the only tool available. The blasting procedure worked as follows. A worker called the driller operated a compressed air rock drill, a pneumatic hammer fitted with a long steel bit, against the rock face. The drill drove the bit in a rapid succession of blows, rotating it slightly with each strike boring a cylindrical hole. A hole 3 feet deep took between 20 and 45 minutes depending on the hardness of the stone. On a typical shift, a drilling crew of 2 men might produce 6 to 10 holes in a single rock face. When the holes were prepared, the powder man entered. He loaded each hole with a measured charge of dynamite, tamped it down with a wooden rod and attached the fuse. The crew cleared the heading. The powder man lit the fuses and walked out quickly. The charges fired in sequence. The rock face shattered into rubble. The smoke and dust settled, or were supposed to settle, before the crew returned. I want to tell you what that smoke contained. When dynamite detonates inside a rock tunnel, it produces a mixture of gases that includes nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, and fine particulate matter. Rock dust ground into particles small enough to float indefinitely in still air. The men who re-entered the heading after a blast breathed that air. They breathed it because they had no alternative. The mechanical ventilation systems in the tunnels were insufficient for the scale of the work. Foreman ordered the crews back in before the air had cleared because the contract was measured in cubic yards of rock removed per shift, and every minute spent waiting for clearance was a minute the yardage was not advancing. The rock dust accumulated in their lungs. Silicosis. The men called it miner's con. They recognized it as a chest condition that began with a cough and ended with a man unable to climb a flight of stairs without pausing to catch his breath. Most of those who contracted it were dead within 10 years of leaving the job. The compensation available to them was nothing. The legal framework for occupational illness did not exist. A man who worked the headings for 4 years and then spent a decade dying of his lungs had no legal recourse. The contractor had paid him his daily wage. The contractor's obligation stopped there. I want to tell you about 2 of those men because 12,000 is a number and numbers do not bleed. The first was Thomas Riley, aged 28, born in County Galway, Ireland, who arrived in New York in 1897 on the SS Umbria. He had been a quarry labourer in Connacht, which meant he already knew the work. When the SubWay contracts opened in 1900, he signed on with the Degnon Contracting Company, which held the section from City Hall to 42nd Street. He was assigned to the drilling crew at the 33rd Street heading, which ran directly beneath the intersection of Broadway and 33rd, one of the busiest corners in the city. Riley operated the compressed air drill. His partner held and turned the bit. They worked in a heading roughly 8 feet wide and 7 feet high, lit by 2 electric bulbs strung on a temporary line. The noise of the drill was so loud that conversation was impossible. The men communicated through gestures. They wore no hearing protection. The ringing in their ears by the end of a shift was severe enough that several men described it in compensation claims as a loud, continuous tone that didn't stop even during sleep. On April 14, 1902, at approximately 2:00 in the afternoon, a charge that had been set in the 33rd Street heading failed to detonate on the first attempt. The powder man, following standard procedure, called for a wait. The wait was supposed to be 20 minutes. The foreman, under pressure from the shift superintendent to achieve yardage before the shift ended, called the crew back in at 12 minutes. Thomas Riley was the first man back into the heading. The charge detonated while he was 4 feet from the drill hole. He was killed instantly. The coroner's report noted multiple traumatic injuries consistent with proximity to a high explosive blast. He was identified by his work tag, a small brass disc stamped with his employee number hung around his neck on a piece of wire. The contractor sent a representative to the boarding house on West 30th Street where Riley had rented a room. The representative paid the landlady $18, which was the remaining balance of Riley's wages for the week. There was no next of kin listed in his employment record. He had written his mother's address in Galway into a notebook that was found in his bunk, but no letter was ever sent. I found his name in the Degnon Company payroll records, cross-referenced against a coroner's register from New York County archived in a storage facility in the Bronx. The payroll entry after his name reads simply, "Final." The second man was Antonio Ferrara, age 33, born in Palermo, Sicily, who came to New York in 1898 and worked in the garment district for 2 years before he was recruited for subway construction by a padrone, a labor contractor who operated in the Italian immigrant neighborhood and supplied men to the large construction projects for a fee taken from both the workers' wages and the contractor's payment. The padrone arrangement was lawful. It was also predatory in ways that everyone involved fully recognized. Ferrara gave the padrone $2 weekly from his earnings of $1.75 per day in return for the position, the cot in the construction camp shack near the excavation on Park Avenue, and the assurance of consistent work. He was operating at a net loss for his first 3 days on the job. He was placed with the mucking crew. The muckers were the ones who entered after the explosion, once the smoke had supposedly dissipated, and scooped the fragmented stone into the ore carts that moved along a narrow, gauge track laid on the tunnel floor. The muck consisted of blasted granite and schist blended with groundwater that perpetually seeped through the rock face. It was dense, soaked, jagged, and would shred work gloves within a few hours. Muckers endured 10-hour shifts, shoveling at a rate dictated by the daily output requirement. A dozen men in a gang were expected to move a designated volume each shift, and Antonio Ferrara labored with the mucking gang from May 1901 until March 1902. In March of 1902, he started coughing. He continued working. By August of 1902, the cough had become so persistent that the contractor's physician examined him and recorded preliminary indications of lung disease. He was not removed from the drilling crew. Instead, he was shifted from mucking to above-ground duties, loading filled ore cars onto the hoist at street level. He passed away on September 3rd, 1903 at New York Hospital on West 16th Street. He was 34 years old. His wife, Maria, had traveled from Palermo in 1901. She was 29. They had one child, a daughter born in New York in 1902. The death certificate lists chronic pulmonary disease as the cause of death. Maria Ferrara took ensuing piecework from a contractor on Mulberry Street and raised her daughter alone in a 2-room apartment on Elizabeth Street. The daughter wed in 1921. She lived to be 82. No one inscribed Antonio Ferrara's name on the completed subway. And here is where the narrative must pivot, because you cannot present this solely as a tale of sacrifice. The men who preceded him and the ones who persevered afterward constructed something that reshaped the contours of American urban existence in ways that persist to this day. Pause for a moment before I escort you below ground. I recognize I ask every time, but this channel is the sole venue where these names are spoken aloud, and the algorithm suppresses the work unless you signal that you desire more. One click, then return. Here is what Parsons and his engineering team confronted at the northern terminus of the line. Above 96th Street on the east side, the bedrock descends sharply and the landscape shifts. The cut and cover technique became unworkable. The tunnel had to go deeper, which demanded a wholly different strategy. Deep-bore tunneling through solid rock with no surface access and no workspace except what the men carved for themselves. The approach was called top heading and bench. The crew would push a smaller opening, the heading, through the rock at the top of the intended tunnel profile, then blast downward and outward to full dimensions in a secondary operation. It doubled the time required to finish each segment, but it was the sole method for preserving structural integrity in unstable ground without surface reinforcement. The problem was water. Manhattan's bedrock is riddled with fractures, and in those fractured zones, pressurized groundwater exploits every crack. At multiple points along the deep-bore sections, water burst through the heading face in flows forceful enough to knock a man off his feet. Work halted. Pumps were brought in. The water was evacuated while men labored behind temporary barriers of timber and oakum. Excavating against the current, the pump crews operated in rotations to prevent the heading from flooding again. At one stretch near 86th Street, the water pressure grew so intense that the contractor brought in pneumatic caisson workers, men experienced in compressed air environments from the bridge caisson projects of earlier decades. The heading was pressurized to counteract the groundwater pressure, and the workers entered through an airlock. The wages were higher. The risk was correspondingly greater. Caisson disease, decompression, sickness, disabled and killed men who emerged from pressurized environments too rapidly. The underlying mechanism was not fully comprehended in 1900. The remedy was not entirely developed. A man doubled over with the excruciating joint agony that workers called the bends went to the construction physician, who had limited treatments at his disposal. Some recovered, some never walked again. Now, let me describe what they devised in the process of carrying out the work. The underpinning of pre-existing foundations ranked among the great improvised engineering accomplishments of the entire enterprise. When the tunnel route passed directly beneath a structure, the building's foundation footings rested in the soil or rock immediately above the planned bore. Removing that rock would eliminate the footing support. The building above would settle, crack, or in the worst scenario, collapse. The answer was underpinning. Before the tunnel cut reached the building's footings, a crew would dig in from the side and maneuver a timber or concrete support into position beneath the existing foundation, transferring the building's load to a new temporary bearing before the old one was removed. On a single city block, a crew might underpin 20 separate footings, each demanding its own strategy, its own temporary shoring, and its own assessment of how much weight was pressing on that particular point. The men performing this work were not following a standardized handbook. No such handbook existed. Parsons' engineering staff developed the procedures as they progressed, amended them when they proved ineffective, and revised them again. A footing that fractured during underpinning meant a halt and evaluation, a redesign, and in some cases the complete rerouting of the bore to avoid the problematic structure altogether. The project did not destroy a single major building along the route. That was not coincidental. That was 12,000 men exercising meticulous precision in conditions that permitted no margin for error. The ventilation issue was never fully resolved during construction. What they had was a network of temporary shafts bored to the surface at intervals, equipped with fans that circulated air through the active sections. In the deep bore areas, the shafts were widely spaced. The air at the face of a heading 400 feet from the nearest shaft was whatever the men made of it. It was sweltering. It was saturated with dust, powder gases, and the respiration of 24 men working in a space the size of a large sitting room. Thermometers at some headings registered temperatures exceeding 110 degrees F in summer. Men worked 2-hour shifts and surfaced for air, then descended again. The output quota did not adjust with the temperature. I want you to stand at the bottom of the 86th Street station today on the platform of the 4, 5, and 6 trains and grasp what you are viewing. The walls are tiled, the benches are metal, the lighting is fluorescent. Behind all of that lies granite that was hand-cut in 1902, blasted with dynamite by men who never knew that a man named Antonio Ferrara worked 20 feet from where you are standing. The curvature of the tunnel wall is precisely the curve that William Parsons, surveyor, sketched on paper in 1895. The rock has not shifted. The subway inaugurated service on October 27, 1904. The initial line ran from City Hall in Low Manhattan to 145th Street in Harlem. 4 years and 7 months after the first spade entered the ground at City Hall Park, John McDonald's team had completed the tunnel on schedule and within financial constraints. The fare was 5 cents. On opening day, 150,000 people rode the subway. By the end of the first week, daily ridership reached 350,000. Within a year, it was 500,000. The city that had been clogged at street level discovered that it had breathing room underground. The impact on New York was immediate and irreversible. The neighborhoods above the Harlem portions of the line, which in 1900 were sparsely inhabited farmland and rocky terrain, began to fill within months of the subway's opening. Developers purchased land along the proposed route before construction ended and erected apartment buildings to accommodate the workers who could now reside in Harlem and commute to Midtown. The population of Upper Manhattan doubled in the decade following 1904. The Bronx, which the subway reached by 1905, grew by 150,000 people in 5 years. The 5-cent fare was accessible to everyone. A garment worker on the Lower East Side could live in the Bronx and commute to work for a dime per day round trip. That dime opened the entire borough to settlement. The ethnic geography of New York was transformed by the fare structure of a tunnel blasted through rock by men who could never have afforded to live in the neighborhoods they created. John McDonald did not amass wealth from the project. The contract terms favored Belmont's Interborough Rapid Transit Company. McDonald's profits when he died in 1911 with his finances in disarray 3 years before the subway was extended into Brooklyn. August Belmont operated the IRT until 1940, when the city purchased his stake for $326 million, 50 years almost to the month from the night the aldermen voted to permit him to build it. William Parsons went on to design subway systems in other cities. He was appointed to the Panama Canal Commission. He taught engineering at Columbia. He died in 1932 at age 73, laden with accolades. His name appears on a street in the Bronx. The Degnan Company and the other contractors who constructed the tunnels are now defunct. Most of their construction records have vanished with them. What survives is fragmentary. Payroll ledgers, coroner's reports, a handful of contractors' personal diaries, the Rapid Transit Commission's official minutes, which document engineering decisions in meticulous detail and record worker fatalities in passing references. 1 man killed heading at 33rd Street, April 14th. That is the complete entry, no name. The name I discovered in a separate document. If you have remained with me this long, I ask you to do one more thing for me. Subscribe, not for me. For Thomas Riley, who enlisted with nothing but a work tag on a wire and did not survive. For Antonio Ferrara, whose lungs failed 2 years after he left the excavation. For the men whose names appear in the payroll books but not in the histories. This channel is the only place where they are named aloud. Tell the algorithm you want more of this, one click. Here is the final segment, the one I keep returning to. The original City Hall station is still down there. It was closed in 1945 because the platform curves were too tight for the longer cars that the system required by then. Rather than reconstruct it, the IRT simply shut it down and sealed it. The tiles remain, the skylights, the Guastavino tile vaulting, the original ironwork, all preserved by nothing except being locked in an underground chamber for 80 years. The New York Transit Museum conducts occasional tours. If you have the opportunity, take one. You stand in a room that has not altered since 1904, and what you are standing in is the original architecture of a tunnel bored by hand through Manhattan schist by men who were paid $1.75 a day to go underground and reshape a city from below. There is no plaque down there for Thomas Riley, no plaque for Antonio Ferrara. There is the tile they excavated through, still holding the curve of the arch that their blasting made possible, still exactly as William Parsons drew it in 1895. The rock they cut still endures. They built the thing that built modern New York City. They built it with compressed air drills and dynamite and hand shovels in the darkness, in dust that killed them slowly, for wages that expired before the month did. And the city still runs on it. That was the New York City subway, 1900 to 1904, drilled through granite and schist by men whose names are in the payroll books if you know which basement to search. I am grateful you stayed. Tell me in the comments if any of your own kin worked the cuts, the headings, or the caissons. I read every comment. I will see you in the next one.